Hi folks, welcome back to Bioethics. This week we are going to be talking about a position known as antinatalism. I like talking about this position in this class because it's really a challenging and counterintuitive position to hold and to entertain. The position itself argues that it is always wrong for anyone ever to have children, that procreation is always a violation of our moral duties. This strikes many of us as a strange position to hold. It strikes me as a really counterintuitive position. But why I like wrestling with it is that the arguments for it can be pretty persuasive. It can be pretty challenging to try to see where exactly the arguments go wrong. And I always think it's worth wrestling with a position that leads us to deeply counterintuitive positions, to positions that we clearly want to reject, but where it's unclear exactly how we should challenge the argument that's before us. So that's what we're going to be doing this week. We're going to look at David Benatar's argument for antinatalism. Benatar is a white South African philosopher. And next week we'll turn to another position that argues for a slightly pared down antinatalist thesis. A thesis that claims that for various reasons we ought to have fewer children, though perhaps maybe we are not morally required to have no children at all. So let's get started with Benatar's position. I want to begin by thinking about the choice to have a child. How do we decide whether we're going to have children? Now, it's important from the start to recognize that not everyone gets to make this decision for themselves. In more traditional societies, this is a choice that's often made for you. For many women in our society and others, this is a position, or this is a decision that they don't get to make for themselves. But I want to focus on the cases where we do make this decision for ourselves, because many of us are privileged enough to be in this position. How, when we have this choice, do we make the decision whether we will have children? Well, some of the things that we consider are the child's effects on our lives. You know, if you have a child, you're going to spend more time at home. You're going to spend more time anxiously worrying about the well-being of that child. You're going to have less time and less money to go out and spend on yourself. And we might think about these effects. We also might think about how fulfilling it would be to raise a child, to teach a child, to share the love that one shares with one's children. These emotional effects that it will have on our lives. We also might think about the long-term consequences of having a child in our life, that it will be someone who will be there to care for us as we age. So we consider how the child affects our own lives. We're also subject to a variety of social pressures. We consider how the child's going to affect the lives of our friends and our family. We consider how happy our parents will be to be grandparents, or how happy our friends will be that we've now joined the play date group rather than the dinner crowd group, or dinner party group. We also consider the economic consequences of children. We consider whether we are financially stable enough to support a child, to care for a child. We also consider whether we'll be good parents, whether our partners will be good parents. If we think that we will, we might think that's a good reason to have a child. And if we think that we won't, well, that might give us reason to hold off. And we also consider whether we have or are carriers for any genetic diseases and the impact that these might have on the child. We think about whether we're going to pass on some problematic genes to this child that we might have. And we think that it's a very good reason not to have a child if we are going to pass on some really significant genetic defects to that child. Now, notice something about these reasons. Most of them are self-directed reasons. Only the last one directly considers the well-being of the child. Economic conditions and fitness for parenthood indirectly affect the child, but the well-being of the child themselves is only brought into consideration in this last decision, or in this last reason. In most cases, when we think about having children, we think about how it's going to affect our lives rather than the child's life. Unless there's some really strong reason for thinking that the child will be harmed if we bring it into existence. This is what Benatar wants to focus on. Benatar thinks we need to think about how our choice to have a child affects the well-being of that potential future child. We need, if we're going to be morally upstanding individuals, to consider how our actions affect others. And the most important other that is affected by our choice to have a child is that child themselves. The standard assumption is that it is morally permissible to bring people into the world whose lives will be good on balance, that there's nothing objectionable about having a child, so long as their life is going to have some benefit to them, so long as there are going to be some pleasures experienced in that life. If it is good on balance, then this is permissible. And we tend to think that most human life is good on balance. Every human life has some suffering. Every human life has some pleasures. We hope that the pleasures outweigh the suffering, that the moments of pleasure outweigh the moments of pain. And we think that, in fact, that's usually the case. Benatar is going to call that into question. Benatar argues that this first assumption rests on another. The first assumption rests on the assumption that being brought into existence is a benefit for an individual, even though not being born is not a harm. Benatar wants to argue that this basic assumption is in fact unwarranted, that being brought into existence is in fact never a benefit to someone, that it's always and only a harm. And if that's right, then we have a moral obligation to not have children, because we are necessarily inflicting a harm on them by bringing them into existence, and not bestowing any benefits on them whatsoever. So how does Benatar argue for this really counterintuitive position? His argument is based on a key asymmetry that he identifies between harms and benefits. Benatar tells us that it's clear that the presence of pain is bad. That seems clear to me. That the presence of pleasure is good. And that seems clear to me. But he says that many of us fail to notice that the absence of pain is good, even if that good's not enjoyed by anyone. We judge it to be a good that pain is avoided, even if there's no one in particular who would have suffered that pain. But that the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there's someone for whom this absence is a deprivation. If no one is being deprived of the pleasure, it's just not bad that pleasure doesn't exist. This asymmetry is going to be the foundation of the rest of his argument. So we're going to spend most of our time today trying to work through it. The first question we need to address is why we should even accept this asymmetry to begin with. Why should we think that this asymmetry that he's identified is one that, well, that makes sense to base our judgments on? And he argues for this by saying that this asymmetry explains 4 other intuitively plausible asymmetries that we make, or that are exhibited in our judgments. Asymmetries between procreative duties, an asymmetry that he calls the prospective beneficence asymmetry, one he calls the retrospective beneficence asymmetry, and a 4th that he calls the asymmetry of distant suffering and absent happy people. So let's take a moment to look at these 4 other intuitively plausible asymmetries. Let's start with the asymmetry of procreative duties. This asymmetry says that we seem to think that we have a duty to avoid bringing into existence a child who will live a life of suffering. Yet we don't think that we have a duty to bring happy people into existence. And this seems right. We said that a life of suffering is one that ought to be avoided. That if a child were going to be born with a severe genetic defect, that gives us reason for not bringing that life into existence. Yet, we don't seem to think that we have a duty to bring happy people into existence. We don't go around thinking that people ought to have children just because their children are likely to be happy. We don't think that they have a moral duty to do that. A life of suffering is one that exhibits the presence of pain. So that life is bad. A non-existent, hypothetically good life is absent any pleasure. But that's not bad, because we have no duty to avoid that outcome. Or it seems to us that we have no duty to avoid that outcome. So the basic asymmetry seems to explain this asymmetry of procreative duties. The asymmetry of prospective beneficence is a little bit different, but related to the first. Preventing the harms associated with a life of suffering seems to us to be a good reason to choose to not have a child. It's why we think that genetic testing is appropriate. Yet it would be strange to cite as a reason for having a child that the child will be benefited. We understand when people say they're not going to have a child because they're the carriers of some genetic disease. But we think that it would fall strangely on the ear if someone told us they were having a child because they thought it would be good for that child. It just doesn't seem like a good reason for having children. Again, avoiding the harms that would befall the suffering child is good, but the failure to bring about the benefits to the happy child, that's not bad. And so, the basic asymmetry, once again, explains this asymmetry of prospective beneficence. The third asymmetry is the retrospective beneficence asymmetry. Here, rather than looking forward to a child that we might have, we think about a parent reflecting on the life of the child that they have had. When a parent has brought a suffering child into existence, it would make sense to regret having brought that child into existence for the sake of that child. They might not regret bringing that child into existence for the sake of that child, but it certainly would make sense to us to entertain the thought that it would have been better if that child had not existed. A tragic thought, but one that isn't incoherent to us. But when one fails to bring a happy child into existence, one can't regret that failure for the sake of that child. One can't regret for the sake of that non-existent child that they were not brought into existence. One might regret for one's own sake that they did not bring that child into existence. Maybe they think their life could have been more fulfilling had they had that child, but they can't regret that for the sake of the child. So again, it would have been good to avoid the harms that befall the suffering child, but it's not bad that one failed to benefit the hypothetical happy child. The basic asymmetry explains the retrospective beneficence asymmetry. The asymmetry of distant suffering and absent happy people. Here, Benatar says, we're rightly sad for distant people who suffer, but we need not shed any tears for absent happy people on uninhabited planets or uninhabited islands or other regions of our own planet. When we hear about a tsunami or a flood or a pandemic or an earthquake, we're rightly sad for the distant people who are suffering its effects. But when we hear about an uninhabited planet that could have sustained life, we're not sad for the lack of happy people who might have been there. Or when we encounter a beautiful tropical island that's uninhabited but would have been a happy place for people to live, we're not sad that it's absent those happy people. In fact, we may rejoice. Better for the island. The absence of their pleasure just is not bad. So the basic asymmetry seems to underlie these four other asymmetries that are really intuitively appealing to us. They seem to be judgments we're willing to make. And so that seems to be good reason for accepting this basic asymmetry between pleasures and pains. Benatar next asks us to consider this asymmetry as he represents it in a chart. In this chart, we see two scenarios. A scenario where A exists, or a scenario A where X exists, where this person exists, and a scenario B where this person never came into existence. Scenario A, the actually existing person, is one where this person experiences both pleasures and pains, because every human life is one of both pleasure and pain. The presence of pain for that person is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. Scenario B, where the person never comes into existence, is one where that never existing person experiences no pain. And that absence of pain, that's good. It's good that pain was avoided. But it's also a life absent, or it's not a life. It's also a scenario where there is an absence of pleasure, because this person never comes into existence. But as we've seen on the basis of the basic asymmetry, the absence of that pleasure is not bad, because since the person never existed, there's no one being deprived of that pleasure. Now, normally, when we consider whether a life is one worth living, we make a comparison between 1 and 2. A life in which the pleasures, the good, outweigh the pain, the bad, is a life worth living. But Benatar says that it's missing the point. It's the wrong comparison to make. What we need to compare is the situation where that person comes into existence and the situation where that person never came into existence. We need to compare A and B, not 1 and 2. So how do we go about doing this? How do we compare A and B? Well, Benatar says do it line by line. For the actually existing person, the presence of pain is bad, the absence of pain is good, so non-existence wins out. For the person who exists, the presence of pleasure is good. For the person who doesn't exist, never came into existence, the absence of pleasure is not bad. How do we make that comparison? What does that mean? Well, the way Benatar asks us to think about it is to think about whether the pleasure experienced by the actually existing person is a real advantage over the absence of pleasure for the person who has never come into existence. And he thinks that, in fact, it is not a real advantage. The pleasure that could be experienced, the pleasure that is experienced by the actually existing person, is not a real advantage over the pleasure that is absent for the person who never came into existence. What does this mean? Well, Benatar asks us to consider two people. I'll call them Sam and Harry. Sam is illness prone. He gets sick fairly frequently, but he recovers really quickly. He's got the kind of immune system that just allows him to bounce back. He might be down for a day, but he'll come right back swinging with no ill effects. This is good for Sam. It would be bad, it would be a deprivation if he lacked this capacity. Harry, on the other hand, lacks this capacity for quick recovery. But Harry never gets sick. He never actually needs this capacity for quick recovery. He never uses it. So the question is having this capacity for a quick recovery a real advantage for Sam? And Benatar's answer is no. It's not a real advantage. It's not something that benefits Sam over Harry. It's not a real advantage because Harry's not missing out on anything in not having this capacity. It's good for Harry that he never gets sick, but it's not bad for him that he lacks the capacity for quick recovery. Because it's not bad that he lacks that capacity, it's not a real advantage for Sam over Harry. Similarly, in the case of our non-existent person, or in the case of our actually existing person, scenario A, it's good that that person experiences pleasures in their life. It would be bad if they were deprived of those pleasures. But since it's not a deprivation for the non-existent person, it's not bad that they don't experience those pleasures, and so the experience of those pleasures does not constitute a real advantage over the non-existent person. This is a difficult point, and Benatar doesn't spell it out all that clearly. But one way that I find it helpful to think about it is to say that it's really a good thing for the actually existing person that they experience some pleasures. Their life would suck if they didn't. It would be a life of pure suffering, and that would be terrible. But those pleasures are only good for them, or only necessary for them, only helpful to them, because they experience these pains, and the pleasures help to balance them out over the course of a life. If there's no pain experienced, well, the pleasures, they're not really a real benefit at all. And their absence, well, it's just not bad. That's the most intuitive way I can think of to get at what Benatar is saying here. Another way to think about what's going on here is to think about deprivation versus absence. It's bad to be deprived of pleasures, but the non-existent person in scenario B is not deprived of anything in never having it existed. The mere absence of pleasure just isn't bad. Well, what does it take to be deprived of something? This is something I want to talk about with you when we come together on Thursday. What is it to be deprived? A few other discussion questions that we might think about, and that I hope you'll think about some before we meet. If this is right, Benatar's argument is right, wouldn't most people regret their existence? And since they don't, doesn't that undermine Benatar's argument? Another question we might have. Do other reasons for having children, self-directed and other directed reasons that have to do with our own happiness or the happiness and well-being of our society or our community, don't those carry any moral weight? What do you think? We also could ask, how great are the harms of existence? If they're not too great, then maybe these other reasons would outweigh them. So how bad is existence really? How significant are those harms? Benatar wants to say they're very significant. Let's discuss that. And finally, is the absence of pain for the non-existent person in scenario B really good? The absence of pleasure is not bad. Shouldn't the absence of pain be neutral as well? Why do we think that it's not? So let's talk about these questions and any other questions that you might have when we come together this week, hopefully on Thursday, if all goes well, with our meeting on Tuesday on Blackboard Collaborate. Until then, good luck.